co-founders here. We were a lot younger back 40 years ago, and we were the young ones. We just want to say how grateful we are to all of you joining us today. And I just wanted to say why this flag is here. This flag draped the casket of David Bing Hing C.W. Chin, Vincent Chin's father, who joined the U.S. Army during World War II when he was almost 40 years old. And because he was at a time of exclusion, had joined the U.S. Army and fought as one of the many Chinese Americans in World War II, he won the opportunity to have a wife, which prior to then, Chinese Americans and so many other Americans were deprived of that, and that's why they were bachelor societies. So when David Bing Hing C.W. Chin died in 1981, only 6 months before Vincent Chin was killed, his funeral, his casket at his funeral was draped by this American flag. And so he fought for America, fought for democracy, fought for this country, and his son was killed because he was not seen as an American. And so we thought we would have this color guard from Mumford High School come and present the flag so that we could honor the Asian Americans who have been part of this democracy. So that is the significance of this flag.
Thank you, Helen. And we will hear more from Jim, Roland, and Helen in our post-panel and program. I'd like to begin by appreciating our partners. What on the screen just a few minutes ago, the Center for Asian American Media CAN, the City of Detroit, Detroit Public Television, Free Film Festival, Detroit Institute of Arts, and the American Documentary POV. We'd also like to thank our sponsors for the Vincent Chin 40th Remembrance and Rededication, our presenting sponsor, Kresge Foundation, our appreciation to the Cerna Foundation, Luz Foundation, Ford Foundation, TAF, the Asian American Program at the Smithsonian, AARP, Tamlin Tamita, and Daniel Blinkoff, and many more listed in our program and our website, vincentchin.org. Now let's give a warm round of applause and show our appreciation to all our sponsors and our partners. It is now my pleasure to introduce a very special guest and a great friend to the Asian American community. And Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities. Please join me in welcoming Erica Murtsugu, Deputy Assistant to the President and Asian American and Pacific Islander Senior Liaison with a special message. Erica.
Never had that happen before, right? Lower the microphone. Hello, hi y'all. I'm humbled and honored to be here in Detroit today representing the administration, remembering Vincent Chin, and rededicating to ourselves to the fight for justice. Thank you to the Vincent Chin Committee, especially Helen Zia, Jim Schmoller, and Roland Wang, and of course the extraordinary Rebecca Insbaum, Director of the Vincent Chin 40th. I'm joined today by my friends and colleagues, Crystal Ka'ai and Rebecca Lee, the Executive Director and the Deputy Director of the White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. We traveled from Washington, D.C. to be here today and come together to honor the memory of Vincent Chin by remembering what his tragic murder meant to our Asian American community 40 years ago. Today as a nation, we still bear witness to this intolerance and violence that is rooted in our society. Vincent's mother, Lily, fought hard for justice for her child and to protect our civil rights. She organized the community to advocate for equality. And the Detroit Asian Pacific American Community formed ACJ in 1983 as a multiracial, multi-ethnic, national interfaith coalition in response to this heinous act of anti-Asian violence. And that coalition endures and carries us today sustaining the global community, and inspiring our entire nation. We thank you all for your faith, hope, strength, and resilience that we see before us today. And it is now my humble honor to deliver a message to you from the President of the United States. I extend my greetings to all those gathered in Detroit to honor the life and legacy of Vincent Chin. 40 years ago, the Asian American community was struck with fear and pain after the tragic murder of Vincent Chin. Vincent was 27, celebrating his upcoming wedding with friends, and he was stopped and brutally beaten to death. Sadly, stories like this echoed today with haunting similarity as xenophobia, hate, violence, and discrimination against the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander community are on the rise. To address this growing crisis, I signed the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act into law, which provides resources to identify, investigate, and report hate crimes, and to ensure that hate crimes information is more accessible to the Asian and Asian community. But this is just the beginning. My administration will continue to stand up against this scourge of discrimination and violence, and to ensure that hate has no safe harbor in America. As we work together to build a better America, we must all renew our commitment to advancing a more just and equitable nation, where nobody is left behind, and everyone can achieve their dreams without fear of discrimination or violence. As you gather today to honor the memory of Vincent Chin, it is my sincere hope that you continue to find purpose worthy of the life he lived. Together, we will honor his legacy by working to ensure that Americans' foundational promises of freedom, equality, and opportunity are within reach for everyone, no matter who we are, what we look like, or where we come from. Signed, Joe Biden. I also have a message from Vice President Kamala Harris. She says, 40 years ago, our nation was shaken to its core by the heinous, racially motivated murder of Vincent Chin. Mr. Chin's assailants were acquitted of violating his civil rights and served no jail time. Instead, for their brutal acts of violence, they were given a fine. This miscarriage of justice left a deep scar on our Asian American community and on our nation. It also awakened a movement dedicated to casting a light on our nation's long history of anti-Asian hate and discrimination, and to creating a future in which all people are safe from violence and discrimination and fear. In recent years, that movement has only grown stronger. In the face of a spike in anti-Asian hate, we see Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities coming together to reflect, to remember, to organize, and to act. On this somber anniversary, let us commit to continuing the fight for justice, equity, and opportunity for all. And this is signed Kamala Harris. I'd now like to present a short video greeting from Ambassador Catherine Tai, our U.S. Trade Representative, a member of the President's Cabinet, and co-chair of the White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders.
I'm Catherine Tai, the United States Trade Representative, and I would like to thank the Vincent Chin 40th Remembrance and Rededication Committee for your hard work and leadership in organizing these memorial events. It is inspiring and encouraging to see how this coalition came together in Detroit after Vincent's murder, and it is hard to believe that 40 years have passed, especially when international and domestic tensions are once again on the rise in recent years. As one of two Asian Americans serving in President Biden's cabinet, I am keenly aware of the systemic hate and violence directed against the Asian American and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander communities. The day before the Senate voted to confirm me to become the first Asian American to serve as the U.S. Trade Representative, a gunman in Atlanta killed 8 people, 6 of whom were women of Asian descent. The fact is that these issues are not new. See the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, and the Wisconsin Sikh temple murders in 2012. In these moments, I am often reminded of the guidance of labor leader and pioneer Philip Vera Cruz, who focused on the gravity of the cause, centered by the dignity and worth of every human being. As we honor Vincent's life, I thank all of you for your commitment to extend his legacy by fighting for true equality and justice. In this spirit, I would like to share some of the dynamics that I have had the privilege to witness recently that continue to give me hope. After last year's shootings, I proudly watched President Biden and Vice President Harris travel to Atlanta to meet with Asian American leaders in a demonstration of empathy, solidarity, and support. A significant portion of my work is traveling to every region of the world and across the United States, both as U.S. Trade Representative and as the co-chair of the President's Advisory Commission and the White House Initiative on AA and NHPIs. In every visit, I try to connect with local leaders as our administration's representative to these AA NHPI communities and as their representative in the federal government. I have the honor to assume the dual responsibilities of defining the Biden-Harris administration's optimistic vision for an inclusive trade policy and to advance equity, opportunity, and justice for AA and NHPI communities. Recently, I joined President Biden in Tokyo as he renamed a beautiful room at the official U.S. ambassador's residence in honor of Secretary Norm Mineta, who passed away in May. Norm's life and legacy are a reminder that those subjected to the most horrific forms of bigotry can be our strongest leaders, filled with empathy and decency. We prevail when we stand together. Even in this time of tension, uncertainty, and significant challenge, and as much as we may feel it to be so, we are not, in fact, isolated and alone. Last month, we marked the National AAPI Day Against Bullying and Hate on what would have been Vincent's 67th birthday. The creation of that day was only possible because so many groups worked together and because so many Americans of all backgrounds were eager to join in taking a stand. We have communities and networks of allies, friends, colleagues, and family. Even the AA and NHPI community itself is a community of communities. Our strength, resilience, and our progress along the moral arc of the universe require us to come together to lean on and support each other. Detroit's proud history of struggle, resilience, and rebirth reminds us that we are stronger when we are united. Thank you for inviting me to be part of your commemoration and reminding me to carry the spirit of your remembrance with me in my work. With me in my work.
Thank you, everybody. On behalf of the President and the Vice President, I'd like to present their statements to the Executive Committee and our Executive Director.
Thank you, Erica. We appreciate your presence here today and your support and partnership for the API community here in Detroit. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our very own Senator Stephanie Chang. Senator Chang is the first Asian American woman elected to the Michigan legislature and a powerful voice on behalf of our community. Please welcome Senator Chang.
Good afternoon. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. My name is Stephanie Chang. I am the state senator right here in Detroit and Downriver, so welcome to my district. And thank you so much to all of the amazing organizations who put this together. And thank you to Rebecca, especially for all of your hard work. I am the daughter of Taiwanese American immigrants who came to this country looking for better opportunity. I'm a mom of 2 young daughters, and I'm a former organizer turned public servant, and as mentioned, was the first Asian American woman elected to the Michigan legislature. I was born in 1983, the year after Vincent Chin was murdered, and did not actually learn about his story until much later when I was in high school. And it wasn't actually in class, it was through an Asian American student group at my high school, and also in reading Helen Zia's Asian American Dreams. So years later, 40 years later, there's so many lessons that we still are learning, right, from what happened to Vincent Chin, and from so much of that anti-Asian hate that we know is still going on in our country. I was proud to work with my colleagues in the legislature, discrimination. But it's so clear that there's still so much more work to do to continue to learn the lessons that we can from what happened to Vincent Chin, and continue to fight for equity and justice for all. In the weeks after the Atlanta shooting last March, I remember having just so many conversations with teachers, with parents, with community leaders who were all asking, why are we not learning about Asian American history in our schools? Why are we not learning about Vincent Chin, especially here in Michigan, where he was killed? And so that spurred a lot of conversations. That this is a national conversation. We're so proud of the work being done at the federal level and across the country. But here in Michigan, we do have a bill that I was proud to introduce, along with several others, to make sure that we can provide a community and an education system where every single student learns about what happened to Vincent Chin, learns about the Pan-Asian American activism that was sparked by the injustice of what happened to him. And so we're going to continue to push for that legislation, and we're going to continue to talk about what does it look like to make sure that all of our children have the same opportunities, and what does it look like to make sure that every single one of our children is learning about all of our history. That's so important, especially right here in Michigan. And then the last lesson that I think is just so important that I wanted to highlight is the importance of pan-ethnic and multiracial coalition building. We are here in Detroit, remembering and rededicating ourselves to justice and to equity, and to remember Vincent Chin on the same weekend of Juneteenth weekend, not too far away from the Juneteenth celebrations at the Wright Museum. And so I think this is an amazing opportunity for all of us to think about, what does freedom mean? What does freedom mean for people of color? What does freedom look like for Asian Americans and all of us across this country? And how can we continue to learn from each other and continue to fight together for a more just and equitable world? So just thank you all so much for being here. I think that this is an incredible moment for Detroit, for Michigan, but our entire country, and hopefully a moment that will make us move forward together. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Chang, for your inspiring remarks. It's now my pleasure to welcome Stephen Don.
I actually wanted to start by expressing our appreciation for all of the wonderful and gracious hospitality that has been presented to us here in Detroit. It has been truly, it's warmed our hearts and brought us all together. So thank you, everyone here in Detroit. I wanted to provide a bit of context of sort of why we at CAM were involved in this. And if some of you have been with us the last couple of nights, we showed two really important films, Bad Acts, a documentary made here in Michigan, I see a number of you are with us. An incredible film. And then last night we watched a kind of restored or refreshed version of Who Killed Vincent Chin, the film that really moved this terrible tragedy and incident and turned it into the movement of the modern Asian American civil rights initiative. And it's a reminder, I think, to all of us of the importance of storytelling, the importance of communicating. It was such a key work that really galvanized and awakened a whole generation of Asian Americans to realize that we were connected to this story. And it's a story that we needed to take up. Anything from all of this. It is the importance of the vital importance and the necessity of telling our own stories. We cannot rely on any other news outlet, mainstream media, and unfortunately, all too often, our political leadership to understand our experiences. And our history is tied up with resisting injustice. So we're going to hear another form of this in the national conversation. And what I wanted to do was let you know, please stay with us. It's what we're going to do is invite Jim and Roland and Helen back up for some reflections. And I'm going to be asking each of you to think about where we go from here, what this weekend means, how can we, each of us, in the roles we play in our daily lives, how can we move all of this forward? How can we rededicate ourselves to action? And how can we support one another? And most importantly, maybe, support the next generation of storytellers to make sure that our voices and our stories are seen and heard. So please stay with us. We will have microphones set up. I wanted to remind us all, I know there is an amazing array of leaders in the Asian American and Pacific Islander community present with us in this theater, but we also have a national streaming audience that will have access to this pre-program and to the conversation afterwards. So in a sense, when you're speaking, we're speaking to a whole nation of our community. Huh? Okay, enjoy the program, and we'll be back with you afterwards. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to all of you to this national conversation on Asian Americans, America, and democracy. Today's important discussion is hosted as part of the Vincent Chin 40th Remembrance and Rededication services taking place in Detroit and nationwide to honor the legacy of Vincent Chin. Our goal today is to consider our shared histories, our shared struggles, and how our communities can be united in common cause through an honest exchange that could serve to strengthen our fragile democracy. We are so fortunate to be joined today by America's foremost thought leaders on race and justice. Each of them have dedicated much of their lives to advancing a greater good working to challenge this country we call home in the hopes of propelling it forward to fulfill its founding ideals. Now, before I introduce today's important conversation, we have an inspiring keynote from the renowned Secretary of the Smithsonian, Lonnie G. Bunch III. He's held this position since June of 2019, is the first historian to serve as secretary, and is the 14th in the Smithsonian's history. Bunch is also the founding director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture.
Thank you for taking part in Remembrance and Rededication to Justice, an event as timely as it is vital. 4 decades ago, when Vincent Chin was targeted and killed because he was Asian American, sadly, it was nothing new. The nation has a long history of directing prejudice and violence at people of Asian descent. It's especially pronounced during times of economic hardship, as we've seen in the past 2 years, a national crisis. Chin's death was an inflection point, causing many people to see themselves as Asian Americans for the first time. It also sparked a multicultural and multiracial civil rights movement. His mother, Lily, was a driving force in keeping her son's memory alive and fighting for justice. Because of her fierce determination, the federal government charged Vincent Chin's killers with violating his civil rights, the first time it had been done for an Asian American. When I think about Lily Chin's courage and persistence in the face of such an unthinkable tragedy, I cannot help but think of Emmett Till's mother, Mamie Till Mobley. Both refused to let America look away from their son's crucial killing at the hands of racists. Both turned their unimaginable pain into action. Both inspired a movement for justice that continues to this very day. Even though those responsible for Chin's death ultimately evaded punishment for their crime, never spending a day in jail, it is vital to know what happened. No matter how painful or unjust our history, we must acknowledge and understand it if we are to learn from it. If we are ever to create a better shared future centered around justice and equality, we must work together across ethnic, racial, and religious lines. When apartheid was abolished in South Africa, it helped convince me that embracing painful history and seeking reconciliation is a powerful tool for change. Museums and other cultural institutions are beginning to be more attuned to issues of social and racial justice. I'm proud that our shared future, reckoning with our racial past, the first coordinated Smithsonian effort to explicitly address race and racism, is working with you on this event. It's the kind of work all cultural institutions should be doing to help bridge communities and foster mutual understanding and respect. Only by learning to live together as one nation will we maximize our potential and live up to our highest ideals. My thanks to all for taking part in Remembrance and Rededication to Justice. You're keeping Vincent Chin's memory alive, and you're continuing Lily Chin's work to seek justice for all. It's a noble endeavor worthy of their legacy. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Secretary Bunch for your stirring message. And now I am honored to introduce our distinguished panel. Award-winning writer and social justice activist Helen Zia was a key spokesperson and organizer in the landmark civil rights movement for justice for Vincent Chin and is the executor of the estate of Lily and Vincent Chin. Helen has written articles, essays, op-eds, and analyses about Asian Americans, most definitively through her book, Asian American Dreams, The Emergence of an American People. She's the co-founder of American Citizens for Justice. She joins us now. Helen, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
And Min Jin Lee is the author of the novels Free Food for Millionaires and Pachinko, which was named a finalist for the National Book Award. Her writing has been featured in The New Yorker and The Wall Street Journal. She is a writer in residence at Amherst College and serves as a trustee of PEN America and a director of the Authors Guild. Welcome, Min. And Michael Eric Dyson is NEH Centennial Chair and Distinguished University Professor of African American and Diaspora Studies at Vanderbilt University's College of Arts and Sciences and Distinguished University Professor of Ethics and Society at the Divinity School. Dyson is one of America's premier public intellectuals and author of over 20 books, including 7 New York Times bestsellers. He served as a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times and a political analyst for MSNBC. Michael, welcome to you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, all of you, for being here for this very important discussion. So let's just set some foundation for folks joining us now. June 19th, 1982, Vincent Chin was viciously attacked. He died 4 days later. He was just 27 years old. And starting in 2020 with the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw anti-Asian hate and violence skyrocket. And Vincent Chin's story and the inspiring movement that followed have now really encouraged and re-inspired Asian Americans to rediscover their history at a time I think many people feel is needed most. So the big question we're trying to look at here is 40 years after his murder, what should we be reflecting on? Helen, I want to start with you on this point, just in the way of background. You graduated from Princeton, you left for Detroit, and eventually became a community organizer. You were on the forefront of social change there, but tell us what we need to understand about what was going on in Detroit at the time. How hard was it to mobilize the community and get things off the ground?
Sure. Thank you so much, Amna, and thank you for leading this discussion. Such an honor to be on with such amazing, leaders to be having this conversation. The Vincent Chin case today resonates with so many people, because people connect to it. They know that that was a time of incredible anti-Asian hate. We are in the midst of one right now. But there is really so much more to understand about that time. The entire context that people should try to get hold of to connect really a better understanding to today. That was a time of incredible economic crisis. Actually, it was a time the entire American economy was restructuring. It was the end of the manufacturing period of America. And that's why, industrial cities like Detroit were in terrible crisis, but so was the entire American society. And it was a time when the government, under the Reagan administration, was dismantling all of the social services, the safety nets. And so it was a time of incredible misery and suffering of the American people. And it was not because of Japan and the fuel efficient cars they were making. It began with an oil crisis. Here we are today. There's an oil crisis. There was inflation. We're talking about how terrible 8% inflation is. It was 18% back then. People could not see a way out of even ever having a job again. And I was one of them. So I was among the people who were so severely affected, wondering if we would ever get unemployment checks again, because that was part of the dismantling of, food stamps, any kind of assistance. And if we look at that, that's one of the reasons we're here today. Those are things we have to understand. And then part of our history as Asian Americans, or part of our American history, is always trying to find somebody else to blame. Don't look to the government. It's these other people's fault. And for Asians in America, that has been part of our legacy that's been baked in to structural racism, to the just the functioning of white supremacy, of society that we're looking at today, of how can we remedy the things that have been so exposed through this pandemic. So those are the kind of things we need to remember about then. And it was a time in the 1980s, not that long ago, that Asian Americans were completely invisible. The questions we would get are like, where did you people come from? Do you speak English? We had to debate things like, should Asian Americans and immigrant Americans be protected by federal civil rights law? That was something we had to debate constantly. Every time we reached out to another group, or even within the Asian American community, because at that time, all the ethnic groups were separate. So there was a whole issue about, do we stand up? Do we speak up? How do we build reaching out to people who have really tried to stay under the radar because they thinking that that would be the safest way. And here in the 1980s, there was no hiding anymore. And so people had to come together and understood that we had to reach out to other communities. And that didn't happen magically. It was all through hard work. It was hard because all of the stereotypes that exist through the United States as Asian Americans being not only foreigners, but foreign invaders out to take your job, out to set up a store in your community, to take money out of another community. These were tropes that were going on through that we had to basically debate constantly. And the thing about the lessons that we want to talk about from that time are that we did it. Communities did it together. There was an idea that we could come together, that we were better as a society coming together, Black, Asian, brown, interfaith, Asian Americans, yellow and brown, of all different backgrounds, that we would be better coming together to fight the inequality and injustice that all communities were facing.
So, Michael, Detroit is your hometown, right? So Detroit, 1982, Helen's just painted this incredibly vivid picture of what life was like. What do you remember about Detroit back then, that time and place? And what did you first hear? And when did you first hear about Vincent Chin? What do you remember about that time?
Yes, well, I'm going to echo Helen's point about joining this august panel of incredible thinkers, myself accepted, to wrestle with this problem. And Helen is being very modest. She's an American hero. She was central to the struggle of Asian Americans. And we think about Dean Frank Wu saying that before Vincent Chin, there weren't really Asian Americans. Now, he didn't mean that empirically. He didn't mean that objectively. He meant that existentially and symbolically, that people held on to an identity, a Pan-Asian identity, that you weren't Hmong or Philippine or Vietnamese or Chinese or Japanese. You were Asian American, an identity both created within the context of this American society that was obsessed with purity, with race, with identity, with whiteness as a paradigm of how American identity functioned, and also imposing its narrow constraints on vibrant and heterogeneous communities. So, like Helen, I'm a graduate student. I was at Princeton, PhD. She's an undergraduate. She came to Detroit, after having pursued for a while becoming a medical doctor, and then, going to join the automobile industry, and then becoming a journalist, and then seeing that journalism wasn't enough. She had to become an activist, motivated by Vincent Chin's death. And my father was a member of UAW, so was I. His alma mater, if you will, was Kelsey Hayes Wheel Brake and Drum Company. I joined that outfit. I worked in that factory, not as a summer job. I didn't go to college till I was 21. So I was right there on the line as well. So those times are very vibrant to me. I'm just a few years younger than Helen, though I look much older. And the reality is, as she has said, the deindustrialization that was going on, the shift to a post-industrial economy, the shift from manufacturing to service industries, where many Chinese Americans, especially in Detroit, when you think about it, a little bit more than 7,000 in a city of 1.2 million back in those days, so that there was a scant presence and yet powerfully reinforced by the vibrant intellectual and cultural traditions of many of the Chinese Americans there, more broadly Asian Americans. And so Detroit was undergoing tremendous and rapid transformation. It had become a, quote, Black city with a Black mayor in 1974. The outmigration of white folk to suburbia, that is white flight, driven by the presence of African-American people, the riots the rebellions of 1967. And then, as Helen has indicated, inflation, the crisis of oil, the rise of Ronald Reagan as president, taking office in 1980. These were radically problematic and troubled times for poor people, for people of color, and the like, and for Asian brothers and sisters in America, but particularly in Detroit, as that city was shifting from one base to another, and the presence of automobile industries from Japan. Now, they didn't mind German ones, right? They didn't mind the Volkswagen. They didn't mind what happened with the Mercedes-Benz or, some other European invention, because that was seen as, a cognate, an elective affinity with the same kind of ethnicity, the same way with Ukraine. Forget the Palestinians, forget the Middle Easterners, forget the other Arabs and so on, or other people who were victimized by horrible forces. But when Ukrainians are at stake, these are Europeans with whom we identify. Many journalists made the point unconsciously. So reading Asian American brothers and sisters as outsiders, as foreigners, as economic competition, and seeing them as the bête noire, as the whipping boy and girl for American failures that were internal to the culture, the crisis of American capitalism, global capitalism. And so Japan is making a car that is more fuel efficient, able to be cheaply consumed and, done right. So they're being punished for the ability to make a better product. We thought Henry Davidson, or was it Ralph Waldo Emerson, said, if you make a better mousetrap, the world will beat its path to your door. And so now here it, of course, was the vicious underbelly of white supremacy asserting itself on the body of Vincent Chin, who was a fun-loving, industrious young man, in many ways shattering the stereotype of what an Asian man would be. He wasn't shrinking, violent. When he was confronted that night, he whipped some ass, and they ain't used to, oh my God, oh, really? Here's a guy who defended himself, who stood up for himself because of the bigotry and the xenophobia of two white men, one of whom is a superintendent or a supervisor at Chrysler, and another who's laid off, blaming him, scandalously assaulting him. So as a young Black man in Detroit, growing up there, born in 58, seeing all these transformations, when I heard about the death of Vincent Chin not long after it occurred, because it was scandalous to those of us who were from Detroit, who lived in Detroit, or who were from Detroit, lived elsewhere. We had seen Kenneth Cockrell, we had seen the UAW Black labor unions, the radical, progressive insurgents of African Americans and others who were there, Grace Lee Boggs, James Boggs, were, dealing with tremendous figures. And so his death was a wake-up call that Asian American brothers and sisters were part and parcel, woof and warp of a larger constituency of the vulnerable. And if race had been black and white along a narrow axis of definition, what Vincent Chin's death reminded us is that race also includes, race also embodies, race also extends to Asian brothers and sisters in a country where their numbers, relatively speaking, were less, regulated by vicious immigration policies, Exclusion Act, and so on and so forth, that wasn't even remedied until 1965. And then the culture couldn't catch up to the law itself. So I was a young Black person struggling within the automobile industry, my father and myself, before I went on to college. And so his death was a wake-up call. It was a horrible reminder, and that Asian brothers and sisters are victimized in the same way. And when you think about it, you think about Mrs. Lily Chin. I mean, you think about the Black mothers now who suffer in pain, and the sheer eloquence of Mrs. Chin in her own language, saying that my heart grieves and I cry tears of blood because I want justice for my son. Here's a man beaten with a bat, the same way that young Black men have been hunted down and shot by shotgun and assaulted He is part of that legacy and tradition, and to claim his battered body as a symbol of the determination of Asian brothers and sisters to be part of an American identity for which they have paid blood redeems the notion of American democracy along with struggles of other minoritized peoples and populations. And his death was a reminder and my inauguration into an awareness of Asian American identity and what we had to do as conscientious Americans to stand shoulder to shoulder with them to do something about it.
I want to explore that idea of standing shoulder to shoulder in just a moment too. But first, I want to bring in Min on this point, just to do a little more foundation setting here and kind of go back to that moment. And Min, just in the way of background for anyone who doesn't know, you came to the U.S. From Seoul when you were about 7, right? You were raised in New York. You went on to study at Yale and Georgetown. So I'm just curious for you, what are your earliest recollections? When did you first learn about Vincent Chin?
I was in middle school when this happened. I had just graduated from middle school in 1982. And then I recall learning about Vincent Chin when I was in college when I took my first Asian American history class. And it's really in college where I became a very politicized person. I think that I'd always been a young, aware, sort of angry person because I knew things weren't fair in the world. But then I think that what happened in college is that the more I studied, the more I understood that there's a lexicon of understanding the long history of the movement of how things have gotten better for the world because of people who say, I disagree with the way things are. So I think learning about Vincent Chin for me personally as a young person was very different from when it happened. When it happened, you're kind of wondering, that doesn't sound right. But then when you actually understand where it fits in the history of the movement, then you think, oh, and then I really felt a call to change. And I guess I've been much more politically active since I was in college.
And Michael, I want to come back to you on this point you raised, because this is something that's often lost in the dialogue that I think is so central when you talk about the movement for justice in Vincent Chin's name. We talk about that moment kind of igniting awakening. And I want to explore what that means. I want to hear from you and Helen both on this, this idea that it was an awakening for people. You touched on this a little bit, but often lost in the dialogue is this idea that many of the Black civil rights leaders of the time played a key role in some of that awakening and mobilizing. Tell me about what we should understand about some of that work.
Well, I'll certainly defer to Helen. I'll very briefly be here, John the Baptist, to her Jesus. So look, there's no question when you see that powerful piece of footage of Jesse Jackson standing up, understanding that we're going to have a rainbow coalition. He talks about all the colors. Then Asian brothers and sisters play a central role in defining what that struggle was about. And indeed, were central to his own run for the presidency in 84 and then in 88. There was a strong Asian contingency intellectually, spiritually, and in terms of philosophy that helped guide that movement. But, you know, understanding that we have to challenge our own bigotry and bias, even as other peoples of color, even as oppressed people, because we know oppressed people can oppress people. Right? You can be, you know, Black or brown and Asian, Latinx, and so on and so forth. And then you could be homophobic and against trans folk and so on and so forth. So we know one form of oppression doesn't guarantee an awareness of other forms of oppression. And the shame that we might have as people of color. As a Black man, we're watching Kung Fu, with David Carradine, an American actor playing a beloved character we had. But of course, I came along when, you know, we were watching The Green Hornet, but it was Bruce Lee, who we loved, right? We didn't, The Green Hornet was all right, but where is Kato? Because that's our guy. That's who we love. That's who we were attracted to. And when Bruce Lee and Jim Kelly in those films were forging a multiracial awareness, you know, culture often is a leading index of what we do socially and politically. It opens doors, creates, you know, opportunities of engagement. And so we can check our own bigotry and narrowness and the stereotypes about Asian folk that float in all of our collective consciousness. So for me, standing shoulder to shoulder meant that we are all better, stronger together. If we understand that we're facing some of the similar ideas, we acknowledge the tensions between communities and what that might result from, and then to address them, to overcome the differences that can be in order to forge a greater union of peoples united against in common faith against the bigotry that we confront.
Helen, what about you? On that same point, this idea of an awakening, you talked about how difficult it was to mobilize people, the hard work that went into getting a community to speak up for itself. And I want to get your take on the importance of someone like Jesse Jackson showing up and standing there shoulder to shoulder with everyone. And this idea that was it an awakening even within the Asian American community that, yeah, the violence perpetrated against Vincent Chin is the same violence that's been perpetrated against people of color and Black Americans for generations? Was that an understanding at the time?
It was an understanding, this idea that we needed to come together, and the understanding that this was something that wasn't just happening today, but was really part of the historical existence of Asians in America. That we in our very first press release, we said this Vincent Chin was killed in 1982. 100 years earlier, 1882, there was the Chinese Exclusion Act. And it was just like frontier justice. Kill an Asian person, pay $1. Kill an Asian person in 1982, pay a little bit of money, and you get off scot-free. And so we consciously tried to make that connection so that within the Asian American community itself, people would see the need to become more visible. I mean, after more than 100 years of trying to, how do we, as a very small community, escape this kind of hate and violence? I mean, even today, this kind of history is missing. I call it MIH, missing in history. And for Asian Americans too, whether it's newer immigrants or ABCs, American-born Chinese like me, who are deprived of this education within our own communities, people didn't even know this. So we had to kind of establish that within the Asian American communities. There would be different Asian ethnicities would see, okay, Chinese and Japanese fought in World War II, but as Chinese Americans and Asian Americans, we can come together, stand up, because as Michael was saying, Asian bodies like Vincent Chin were despised, hated. The fact that he was going through the all-American ritual of a bachelor party, having a good time celebrating, that was just despicable to his killers. They could not bear to see that, and they hunted him down and killed him. And so that was something that really woke a lot of Asian Americans up, because they could see that if in 1882 you can kill an Asian and get off scot-free, in 1982 the same thing. It was Vincent that day, but it could have been any other Asian American. And so there was part of that, just trying to bring Asian Americans together to educate ourselves so that we could stand up and demand justice like any other community, should be treated as full Americans. And we acknowledged and leaned on the fact that, it was African Americans, the Black civil rights movement, that paved that way for Asians in America. So that was something that we consciously undertook then. And it was an effort. And when we went to, the leaders in the Black community, there was Jesse Jackson, but in Detroit, there was Horace Sheffield, who was a great leader, a great unifier in Detroit, had created an organization for Black community organizations to come together. He stood with us. He helped advance us. He introduced us to other organizations in the Black community. And when we met them, though, it was up to us to answer questions like, well, you Asian Americans, are you just here to ride on the coattails of the Black movement? Or is that what you're talking about? And so we had to meet with people and to say, or another question, where were you when we were having the Freedom Riders and, facing down dogs and fire hoses? And where were you, Asian Americans, then? And so we had to do that educating as well, making ourselves visible and saying, well, we are fighting for justice for all Americans. We will stand with the Black community too. The principles of American Citizens for Justice was we fight racism against all communities and we stand for justice for all Americans. And so that was something, yes, we had to consciously talk about unity and solidarity, and that we were standing for democracy for all Americans, including Asian Americans, yes, but for all Americans.
Helen, those are conversations, I'm sorry to interrupt, those are conversations we don't hear a lot about, and I'm fascinated to hear more about that. Just the tension at the time when you talk about the hard work it took for people to recognize what solidarity looked like and felt like and meant. When someone's asking you, where were you? Why weren't you there? What are those conversations like? How do you bridge those divides?
Well, part of it was to say, actually, we were there. We are missing from the picture. But there are photographs from one of the marches on the Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, where the entire front line of the march, including the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and John Lewis, they're wearing leis. The leis, where did the flower leis come from? They came from marchers from Hawaii who came all the way from Hawaii to participate. So some of it is we had to say we are there, we were there. And we will be here. I mean, we also had to acknowledge, yes, there is a lack of understanding within our own communities, a lack of knowledge of the civil rights movement, and really the debt that the Asian American community owes to the Black community for the very fact that the Immigration Act of 1965 existed as part of the civil rights movement. And so much of the immigration of Asian Americans today, we owe a thanks to the fact that the civil rights movement existed to equalize the immigration laws. Not enough of that is talked about. And so we had to acknowledge all of that and to say, no, we are not here to ride on the coattails of the Black community. But the thing is that we had to make the effort to have that conversation. And I think the difference between today and back then was that people were open to listening. And, we've gone through 40 years of very intensive and deliberate efforts to keep our communities divided. Today, I think there are so many roadblocks that prevent groups from even being willing to listen. And I think that's part of our conversation today. I mean, I want to ask Michael. So, for example, in the Black community today, my perception is that we went through a horrible 1980s that began with the disintegration of the safety net, for all people, but the blame was then laid on Asian Americans. And so the 1980s kind of established that. We ended with anti-Asian hate directed to Koreans. We began the 1990s with the LA uprisings that then, to me, began to cement the idea that Asians are the enemy, not only to America in general, but to the Black community. And I think we have significant unlearnings, dismantling of those kind of poisons that I think were interjected on all Americans, but also to keep Asian and Black communities apart.
Yes, no, I think it's you brilliantly articulated that and laid it out, because we know white supremacy's enemy is anything that challenges the logic of superiority inherently of whiteness. And so it will use, one minoritized group against another. And it's to the advantage, which is what I'm constantly trying to preach to my particular communities and more broadly to America, to demonize and stigmatize Asian brothers and sisters, Korean shopkeepers, nail keepers, and so on, is a resentment of the lack of access to capital that Black people should have received legitimately in a justice system and an economic system in America, where we were denied access to even start local businesses. Well, the Asian folk are coming here and they're getting over and they're putting shops in our neighborhoods and they're treating us with disdain and we don't have what they have. Look, there's one thing to acknowledge the way in which American capitalism has operated at the behest of white supremacy to deny legitimate opportunities to African American people, to Black people, and to give crumbs to Asian brothers and sisters without demonizing Asian brothers and sisters as the origin of the invidious practices that we need to call out. So we can't demonize Koreans and Vietnamese folk and so on. We got to talk about a system that would dare that would dare, dole out resources here and there to keep us at each other's necks without understanding we have much more in common. And often and I'm sure we get this in all communities, hey, let's take care of the Black people first before we go over, hey, let's take care of our own Asian communities first before we go. I get all that. But the point is we are tied together, as Dr. King said, quoting Howard Thurman, in an inescapable network of mutuality. That what happens to, Latino, what happens to African American, what happens to Asian American, what happens to Indigenous, happens to all of us. Different means, different ways, different privileges that some of us have as a result of our senior status, Black people as the senior brother and sister, so to speak, in the struggle for civil rights. But what I often remind African American people, well, they're taking our mottos and running with them, gay and lesbian and transgender and bisexual people, and they're dipping into our stuff. Well, what copyright did you pay Mohandas K. Gandhi for the notion of nonviolence? Because as I remember, Dr. King talked about that little brown saint from India. He's reading M.K. Fisher's book. He's talking about Mahatma Gandhi, Satyagraha, Ahimsa. So here's a guy, the major leader of African-American people, himself inspired by Mahatma Gandhi. There ain't no copyright on justice and no copyright on ideas and inspirations. And we've got to, to acknowledge that one group should inspire the next, one movement inspire the next. African-American struggles, civil rights struggles, the 1965, Immigration Act, yes, along with the Voting Rights Act of 65, the Civil Rights Act of 64, and in homage to Dr. King in 68, the Fair Housing Act. But at the same time, the inspiration for the women's movement, for the feminist movement, it lies in African-American struggle. So nobody has a copyright. Nobody has the right to deny other people's borrowing from our inspiration to inspire themselves in their own struggles and to admit our own biases, making little sounds like what Asian folk would sound like. We did that in Black communities. We have to be honest about our own internalization of the fetish of Asian identity as a footstool for America, because they are a supplicant. They will be deferential. They will not challenge what happens in society. That's why I say Vincent Chin, that night when these white supremacists, auto workers were engaging in demonizing him, he stepped right up to the plate and stepped around and challenged them and got in their faces. And similar to Mike Brown challenging a white cop, because you're 6'4", so is Mike Brown. So now you are intimidated by the exercise of power of somebody when the guns are laid aside and the badges are taken off, except the gun wasn't laid aside and the badge was there. So I'm saying all that to say we've got to challenge and check our own internalization of white supremacist logic that makes us feel we're competing with Asian brothers and sisters, Latino brothers and sisters, while acknowledging certain privileges that each group has received in regard to American society and how we've got to learn to share and open up. And so for me, it's extremely important to remember the interconnection of these groups to check and challenge our own narrow concerns that are self-involved without understanding how together we have a far better chance of remedying the fundamental problems of inequality in this nation that, again, the death of Vincent Chin reminds us that Asian brothers and sisters are fully implicated in.
Man, I want to ask you on this point about the interconnectedness, right? Because I think each of you have done such a wonderful job of connecting the history of our communities, the shared struggles, the shared sort of views, and to where we are today. And Min, one of the things you've written on extensively is sort of the response to the surge of anti-Asian violence we've seen over the last couple of years. There was one New York Times op-ed in particular that really stuck with me. I know resonated, was shared a lot in my circles. And there was a line you wrote in there that said, ever since Asians began arriving in the United States, they've been met with hostility and rejection, often sanctioned by state and federal legislation. The sad part is that so little has changed. And I guess the question of that is, now that, there's been a response to this wave of anti-Asian violence, is there a concern? Is there a risk that you see that Asian Americans only fight for themselves? How do you view this issue of interconnectedness right now?
I really like this question so much because I think interconnectedness is the only way we're going to solve the problem. However, We have a problem because I don't know if everybody feels interconnected. So part of what I try to do is tell stories about how we are connected and how actually I might be somebody that you might feel a connection with. And actually I have to go all the way there because the sad thing is that people don't think that I'm actually human. This is the problem with invisibility. This is a problem with eternal foreignness. This is a problem with an ahistorical understanding of a human being, is that they're not really seen as fully human. So I have to sometimes take a really long, deep breath and go, okay, how can I tell this story in a way that you actually see me as possibly you? So I kind of joke that my challenge in life and my mandate in life in terms of telling stories is I'm trying to make you Korean. And people always kind of laugh about this, but I'm saying that because if you can feel Korean, then perhaps you can realize that you could be me in the same way I'm always thinking that I could be you. And that is the interesting thing about being an immigrant in this country, is that we're hyper patriots normally, despite all of the understanding that we have. And I brought up the idea of being politicized in college, whereas I was not so politicized in high school. I just had these feelings that there was something going on. And I say it because when we decide to become politicized, we actually feel like we're making a difference. And just trying to get Asian Americans in America, which has an enormous tent of so many different histories, to feel politicized, that itself is a kind of action, because not everybody wants to be joined by this identity of victimhood. And that is the way some Asian Americans feel. I don't want to think about Vincent Chin. I don't want to think about him because it's a sad story. I've heard this so many times. So rather than thinking about the fact that this oppression existed then, it exists today, I think some people say, well, can I just like celebrate things instead and talk about the delicious food of Asian Americans? And I think, okay, that's one way to understand it too. But at this point, my attitude is, how do I just get you to be under the tent and say, hey, you know what, we are connected and we really like each other, or sometimes we don't like each other, but we're really complicated. And if each person could tell the story, then all of a sudden we would start to become more and more human. I mean, I hate to say this, but whenever you think about racism of any person, any oppressed person, or sexism, what you're really saying is they're not fully like the majority. So we could talk about white supremacy, and I really want to, but very often we don't even talk about how white women who participate in white supremacy don't talk about how they are being erased by the hatred of not being the powerful majority. So, and when I start talking about these things, very often I notice that with my students, they start to go, oh, wait, am I supposed to be angry at everybody? And I'm like, no. But even just talking about it threatens so many people that they are afraid of being political. And I keep thinking, like, how can I change this? How can I change this? And that's the reason why I keep going back to story and personal stories, because perhaps then you'll see that I'm not just angry about Vincent Chin, or that Vincent Chin is happening today, because just this week, I believe a white man in New York was arrested in Queens for having murdered a Chinese delivery worker a month ago. And he had been repeatedly threatening to hurt the owner of the Chinese restaurant in Queens because he didn't have enough duck sauce. Like, I can't make this up. So this gentleman went and started to slash the tires of the owner of the restaurant. And then recently he murdered the delivery worker of this restaurant because of duck sauce. And repeatedly, the owners of this restaurant had contacted the police and said, there is a person who keeps attacking us. And they had filed reports over and over and over again. And yet it took almost a whole month before this gentleman was arrested as a suspect of murdering a Chinese delivery worker when he was just doing his job. So how is that different than Vincent Chin? Well, the only difference is that, like Dr. Dyson said, this time the Chinese delivery worker wasn't just having a good time and standing up for himself. He was just doing his work. And because of his race, because of his physical body, he was being targeted to be murdered because this man decided that he represents everybody who works at that restaurant. I mean, that is the classic definition of racism, right? When we can't be distinguished from one another because of our race. So when I think about that, I think, well, how do I tell this story in a different way? And hopefully, I still have this optimism that people can learn and be changed.
I mean, you spoke so eloquently on this issue of narratives, right? The need to connect people through storytelling. And each of you are storytellers in your own way. So Helen and Michael, I'd love to hear from you on this like creation of new narratives when, we have predominant narratives, particularly when it comes to stories of, racial discord between our communities. When it comes to creating a new narrative, Michael, I want to hear from you first on this, if you don't mind. What are those first steps to moving beyond some of those narratives, to telling a new story?
Right. Well, as men just brilliantly expressed, the shape of our existence often happens in story. It's shaped by narrative. It's shaped by once upon a time or in the beginning. And so when we think about the truths we aim to grasp, we do so through anecdote. We do so through, hey, this is what happened to me. And her insistence that we establish a baseline of commonality is both refreshing, but also strategic, because it allows us to say, in many ways, you think I am the other, but I'm really you. So making everybody Korean in the same way that if you live in Chicago, on St. Patrick's Day, everybody is Irish. The water is turned green, and top of the morning to you, right? And we might hear some Yates, or we might hear President Biden talking about shenanigans. So the thing is that we tap into the ethnic vein that allows the flow of an identity that is not intimidating. Now, on the one hand, some people would say, well, that's the problem with Asian Americans already. We're already deferring. We're already, denying the legitimacy of the vigorous response or the anger or the hurt and pain being articulated. But at the same time, the beauty of what it means is that we're bringing a redemptive character in the same way that African American people did. You kill 9 people in a church, and before the bodies are cold, we're forgiving a murderer who doesn't seek forgiveness. And so Asian American brothers and sisters in a nation that has, as both Helen and men said, rendered them invisible, connecting us to Ralph Ellison in the early 50s. I am invisible, you see, because people refuse to see me, right? That invisibility that men, that Helen, that Michael, that joins us together is a common invisibility. It happens in different ways and spaces with different traces, but we all know the denial of our being. You don't even see me here. I go into a shop and you can't even see me. You can't call upon me. You think I'm a problem or a threat, and you overlook me or you undersee me. So telling that story is extremely important. Say, hey, I'm an American the way America should be. I'm a human being in a way you can't acknowledge. I want the same thing you want. Can you not understand that when people of color go to see films, they don't have to have an Asian character in them. They don't have to have a Black character in them. They don't have a Latino character in them. We're crying. We're looking at James Stewart. What a wonderful life. And we're looking at Christmas and oh my God. Or we're looking at, I don't know, we're looking at some Die Hard, right? And there ain't many brothers in there, and the Asians in there with the joke, hey, we had to get you back, for what happened in, Pearl Harbor. So we got you back with transistors and so on. An interesting kind of comedic moment there that let loose a truth about what's happening culturally that couldn't happen politically. So the point is that we're establishing a baseline of commonality. That's what Dr. King was saying. We are your brothers and sisters. Is it incumbent upon Black and brown and Latino and Asian folk to do that? Is it wearying? Yes. Because don't white folk have to establish a baseline of their humanity to us? They should, but they don't. Part of white privilege is not to bear that burden, what James Baldwin called the burden of representation. So yes, I think stories are important. I think narratives are important and to insist, but bigotry's insistence is that we don't participate in those narratives, that we're not part of that story. And so I think what we have to do is to retell the story, to continually remind our brothers and sisters we are part and parcel of what this nation is from the very beginning. Whether it's Stevie Wonder saying first man to die for the flag we now hold high was a black man. And then he gets on to Samuel Hayakawa in terms of semantics there. And he reminds America that every nationality, every color has made us who we are today. So I think Min is absolutely right in her own brilliant work doing it, in Helen and her powerful activism, and me trying to do what I can. It's extremely important at the end of the day to tell a narrative, to tell a story, to tell a truth, and to say we're going to narrate it from our position, but we are you and you are us. If you can take that leap of imagination. We live in a nation now where they're banning books, which means they're banning stories, which means they're banning narratives. They're banning bodies. They're banning ideas because the threat of the other is so powerful. I'd rather not deal with it and live in what Gore Vidal called the United States of amnesia. And what Min is doing and what Helen is doing is, and what I'm trying to do is to reject our citizenship in the United States of amnesia and claim our membership in the kingdom of memory.
So Helen, how do we avoid living in that United States of amnesia? You made a point earlier that I picked up on, I want to circle back to, about how people back then, you said, seemed much more willing to listen, that there was a sense of urgency in responding to the moment. Correct me if I'm wrong here. Is there a sense that some of that urgency and response has faded? Or are we no longer, you think today, able to listen to each other in the same way you saw back then? And what does that mean for the work going forward?
Yeah, Amna, that's a great question. And I think, as Michael and Min so beautifully articulated, the importance of reclaiming our humanity, and our mutual humanity, and our stories of commonality that bind us together. It's not a matter of that people are less willing to hear. I think it's that the narrative has been so strong that we are hopelessly divided as a country, that the different communities, Black, Asian, white, brown, red, can never come together. That when I talk to people or hear what's on WeChat within the Chinese community, or, read about what's on social media or what's going on among, Black Twitter, there's a view that Asians hate Blacks, Blacks hate Asians. They will never overcome that. There's anti-Blackness within the Asian American community. There's anti-Asianness, throughout the rest of America. And so that has become such a strong narrative. So to be able to reclaim the common, thread of our humanity, that is going to take actually undoing all of that, of the and to me, the only way we can do that is face to face. Social media is great, but organizing social change, making a difference to people is and establishing humanity is to be able to meet with other people. I mean, in the 1980s, that's really what we did. But we didn't have social media then. And so we had to go to another organization. We had to go to their meetings. We invited them to ours. We broke bread together. And that's, first and foremost, a way to just meet each other. And then in the broader way of sharing each other's stories, our real stories of our joys, our woes, the suffering of our ancestors, the overcoming of that. To Min's point, the Vincent Chin story it's not a story of victimhood. It's a story of standing up. It's a story of how Michael said he stood up. That immediately disrupts that whole, passive racist model minority thing. He stood up. He was punished for it. But then our community came back and stood up and said, there are consequences for beating on, any people, including our communities. And so part of those consequences have disappeared from the public understanding today. Now it's the dehumanization of Asian Americans. You can just stomp on somebody's head as though they're an insect. And we see that happening over and over again. And the idea that there will be no consequences and they won't fight back. And so that's not true. But that today, the urgency to do that, it couldn't be more urgent. All of our communities, whether we're talking about Buffalo or Uvalde or Indianapolis or Atlanta or too many other places to have to name now, all our communities are under siege. The only way we'll overcome this is to break through, blow up that divided, never come together narrative that has become so deeply embedded to keep us apart, deliberately to keep us apart. We have to find conscious ways to change that through conversations like this, but to actually take it to communities. I mean, I would really like to know how, Michael and Min feel about how we can, break through that. Both of you grew up in different churches. I did not, but I see that as a way that we can begin to change those narratives. In New Jersey, Illinois, other states are trying to bring that into K through 12. So to me, that's how do we do this? Because the three of us, we all agree about, we have to change this narrative, that we have to create ways of showing our commonality, because society is changing. Within a very short time, it's going to be a majority of minoritized people in America. If we came together as the majority, as well as with people of conscience, with people of color, we are the majority today. And so the divisions actually are, I think, very deliberate to keep us apart, because we are the majority and becoming more of the majority. So the vexing question to me today, to maintain my optimism, is how do we reclaim that ability to hear each other, to create spaces where we can come together and actually, hear each other's stories and find that common thread so that we can work together to change the very urgent situation that we are in today.
So, Min, let me turn to you on that then, to pick up on this wonderful question that Helen has posed, which does bring us forward. When you talk about doing the work, you've talked about storytelling and narrative building and humanizing, that's tough work, but showing up, right? And being there in shared space. How do we do that? How do you see that being put into action right now? How does that give us direction moving forward?
Well, I'm kind of sneaky. So I'll just tell you what I do as my little strategy. So recently, the New York Times, a couple of years ago, asked me if I could write about a book that influenced me that people aren't talking about enough. So then at that moment, I said, you know what? The person who really influenced me in college in an enormous way as a writer was Bell Hooks, because I took 2 of her classes. So I said, you know what? I could talk about many, many, many writers, but why don't I talk about my intellectual debt to a person who really changed me? So then I spent a lot of words on this essay about Bell Hooks. And then what was really interesting is that this is my sneaky part. I wanted there to be in the archives that there is a person in my body who was affected by a person of her intellect and who has a different body than mine. So, because if I said, oh, I was really influenced by George Eliot's Middlemarch, which is true, and I've talked about that, but I thought, you know what, a lot of people can talk about that. But I met Bell Hooks and I studied with her for 2 classes. So I did that article. And I thought, for the rest of my life, I did that. And in the same way, because I studied 19th century literature, I read so many speeches and articles by Frederick Douglass. So then, because I knew the way he argued, when I read Dr. King's letters, it made sense to me the way he argues. And what was really so interesting about the 19th and 20th century thinkers like Frederick Douglass and Dr. King is that they always used so many classics of white people to kind of convince white people like, oh, by the way, I know your stuff as well as mine. And that to me was sneaky and brilliant. So all these subversive aspects of their writing affected me. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to take a page from their book. and try to figure out how I can do that. So I do that all the time. And also in terms of personalities, like I have so many friendships with people of color from different communities. And whenever I do, I actually do something really sneaky on social media. I will actually share all these images of me being with other people who are not necessarily of my own community. And I do something even sneakier. I will show pictures of me with people in my own community. Why? Because so many successful Asian Americans believe in tokenism. So I am combating tokenism by showing up very often with other East Asians, as well as African Americans, because I'm trying to say, and South Asians and Muslims. And I talk about it because this is my little way of saying, for the record, I disagree with saying that I'm a white adjacent person, because I'm not. And I disagree with the idea that all I want to do is to become and have the same rights as a white man who's straight, because that's not what I believe in. And if I can leave that record, and if I can inspire other people who read me and, look up to me or whatever, to think, oh, it can be done, then perhaps they will do their own version of this. And that might make a difference. Do I know if it'll make a humongous revolutionary change? No idea. But you know what? At least I have it on the record that I disagreed and that I have a new narrative, a counter narrative of the world I believe in. And that makes me feel like I can go to sleep at night because I did my little bit. And it may not be enough, but it's better than nothing.
I love the sneakiness of it all. I love the subversiveness of it all. Michael, on this same point, when we're looking forward, we should quote now from your newest book, Unequal, A Story of America. You're talking about the people who dare to fight for a more equal future. And you're connecting those people with the generations of future young leaders and readers, right? So talk to me about some of the lessons from that. When you're talking about people who dare to fight for a more equal future, what are those key lessons for the people hearing this conversation, reading your book, wondering what they can be doing right now?
Yeah, well, I love the subversion and sneakiness of men. I think it's something we've all learned being in a minoritized position. We got to figure out, how do we tame the beast? How do we deal with the lion in the jungle? And how do we convince people that you don't have to see, to every hammer, everything is a nail. And so, one of the ways I do it is through humor as well. When I'm giving keynote speeches, because I know it's going to be tough for you to hear what I got to say. So I gotta say it in a way that shows you I'm self-deprecating. I can look at my own in a certain way. I can look at yours in a certain way. And so I do it through literal narratives, stories, songs. I'm living in Nashville now. People surprised I'm a big country music fan. I'm quoting white guys who, if they knew my politics, would never talk to me. And yet I'm digging what they do. I might dig a Clint Eastwood movie. I stand against everything he represents politically, but I respect his craft and his art, right? Or Waylon Jennings. I'm proud to be an Okie from Muskogee. My God, George Jones, Dolly Parton, whose politics line up perfectly with mine. So I understand that, so I flip it on its head. And I show, look, I took the time to come over to your side. What you gonna do to come over to mine? I'm taking the time to really put myself in your position to talk about stuff you love. So I'm gonna talk about Thomas Jefferson or Thomas Paine. I'm gonna speak about the greatness of what they do, but then I'm gonna say, but they weren't perfect either. So how do we figure out what to do with the documents they left and the arguments people make? Then I can get into some deeper stuff. And I think about the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, who said, optimism is a shallower virtue than hope, right? Because when I hear men in hell, and I hear hope. Hope is against the evidence. There's no reason for you to believe it, and yet you continue to believe it, right? Hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope, Dr. King said. Hope is something that is so deeply entrenched as a possibility that no matter what empirical evidence we can claim to contradict it, we hold fast to a belief that this thing, this moment, this movement, this culture, this nation, these politics will be transformed. And so, we insist that in revealing our humanity, we expect it to be shown in return. And we don't ask anything of you that we're not willing to do ourselves, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And so I think when I go to, and I speak for the most part in majority white colleges and spaces that ain't naturally given over to what I do. I had a debate with Jordan Peterson in Toronto on his home turf. Bro, I ain't never scared. Where are you at? Let's go. But at the same time, trying to do a little humor, you know, which might go over like a brick cloud. But the point is that you make the effort to show people, even your goofiness, and they go, oh my God, he's telling dad jokes for real in the middle of this seriousness. Yes, because I think we should take what we do with deadly seriousness, but we should never take ourselves too seriously at all. So there's a balance in that. And I think going into these difficult conversations, either between minoritized peoples and, as Helen has said, the global majority, because that's what we are already, or in between communities that are fighting over crumbs, right? Martin Luther King Jr. is in jail, speaking about a story, you know, he tells it, I think, in his letter from Birmingham jail. When the white guy is going, the warden and the jailer, Dr. King, you're wrong. This integration stuff is wrong. Segregation is the right way. They're arguing. He said, no, it's not. And then he finally asked, how much money do you make? And when the jailer tells him how little he makes, Dr. King basically, hell, you need to be out here marching with us. So the point is, if we can establish that baseline of commonality and show we got a lot more in common than you think we do, then we have the possibility of transforming America. And what would America really be like without Asian brothers and sisters, Asian American brothers and sisters? What would America be like without Black folk or Latino folk? This would be a boring nation, and a nation not living up to its true ideals. America gets to test its commitment to its values best when those of us who are, quote, outside the perimeter of their pure tests, of their purity test of what America is, allow America to see what it really is, reflected in our culture, reflected in our strivings. So yes, Vincent Chin is not merely a victim. Vincent Chin is a test of durability of the American dream. It's not a failure of Asian communities. It's a failure of an America that refuses to include Asian brothers and sisters. But at the same time, we're so quick to, I don't want to be a victim and stuff. And I get that. But those who are truly vulnerable, those who are truly victimized, there's a difference in, acknowledging that we have been victimized by white supremacy, but we refuse to be victims of white supremacy. And we stand up and we are agents of our own destiny. I think that kind of balance is extremely important. And then it resonates with white brothers and sisters. When I teach these young white kids who are in my class, some of the conservative people out here are worried, oh my God, we're doing CRT. They don't know the difference between CRT and OPP. They ain't got no difference. They ain't got no understanding of what's going on. But their kids go, my God, I'm listening to the Dyson. I'm mad at you because you didn't teach me this stuff before. That's another subversive thing. I get a lot of hate mail from older white people. You're just trying to warp our kids. Yeah, I am. Because you warped them. I'm trying to de-warpify them. And so I'm trying to give them something that's going to be able to challenge that stuff. So when I do that, I'm planting seeds. Excuse me, I'm an old Baptist preacher, 41 years. The Bible says somebody plants the seed, somebody waters it, and God makes it grow. I got to keep planting these seeds. I might not see it grow in my lifetime. Somebody else is going to come along. Vincent Chin, the seed planted in the ground in 82. Helen Zia working, watering that. 5 years, 10 years, 15 years later, her remarkable book, Men, with her award-winning prose, watering it even more, allowing that plant to gain strength in the sunlight of common striving. And then hopefully the universe, God, whatever you believe in, allows us together to grow. That's why I keep maintaining hope over optimism to say, no matter how dark it is, we're going to get out of this thing together if we're willing to do the work necessary to get it done.
Let's talk about those seeds you planted all those years ago, Helen. And I'm going to give you the final word on this incredible conversation here, because Vincent Chin is the reason we're here right now in conversation, right? 40 years of that work. And I know I speak for so many people when I say we sit in awe and respect and gratitude for everything that you started all those years ago and continue to do today. But when you think about everything we've reflected on today, what Min has so eloquently put, what Michael has so eloquently put forward, when you think about the work moving forward from here, when you think about what is yet to be done, what are your takeaways? What do we need to personally, each of us, commit to?
So thank you, Amna. First, I just want to say amen to Michael and Min to be talking about the seeds that were planted. And let me just say first, it was a movement that was created then. There were many of us who were watering those plants, many of us trying to cultivate those seeds back then. So I was just one of them. But when I think of where we are today, we have a lot of unfinished business. We have a lot of plants that are growing that have had poison thrown on them that we have to reclaim the notion of unity that, back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, that there was no question. It wasn't about allyship. It was about unity. It was about the word community having unity within it. Now we have so much more to have to recultivate those plants. And so I guess that's where I want to leave it. I can't improve on anything that Michael or Min has said already. Just that the lessons that we have to claim today are really about not victimhood, but about coming together, about what we can do in the future together. And we must. So that's where we are today. That's why we're commemorating, remembering what happened to Vincent Chin. It's what happened after and the community coming together. So I would just say that's our task ahead. All of us listening to this, all of us. The alternative is to be silent and do nothing. And if we do that, we are part of the problem. So if we want to be part of bringing our communities, all communities together in this democracy and making it work, we have to do something about it. Water those plants together and come together, if not for ourselves, then for the future generations.
Water those plants together and watch the garden grow. Helen Zia, Michael Eric Dyson, and Min Jin Lee, thank you so much for your wisdom and your generosity and for providing all of us a pathway forward together. As we wrap up this conversation, I think I speak for everyone when I say it's our hope to everyone watching that this is just the beginning of more conversations for all of you, that you take these talks with you, you make them your own, and more importantly, you continue them, you keep them going. So on behalf of this national conversation on Asian Americans, America, and democracy, I'm Amna Nawaz. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay. Wasn't that remarkable? Let me tell you how this is going to work. We do want to hear from you, and we are streaming this, as I said. We're going to bring back out the founders of the Americans for Justice, and we're going to set up a microphone. And if you're able to, please come down to this side, and we'll have a microphone. We also do, though, have two folks helping us, two volunteers with microphones in case you have any mobility issues. But what we'd like to do is have you think about your reflections and come on forward. And maybe for our COVID protocol, we'll sort of make sure these are separated a bit. Thank you. Okay, let's bring in Helen Zia and Roland Wong and Jim Shimura. Please join us. Because I have the reporters. You know, one of the things I forgot to mention, I was so discombobulated about trying to get the show going. I didn't mention that why a bunch of us are here from the Center for Asian American Media for CAM, because we've held on Thursday and Friday a convening of regional filmmakers, primarily documentary filmmakers from the Midwest. And it was the first time gathering. We had about 60 people there. And it's been really a wonderful, wonderful time finding out the stories that are being examined, sharing our own, people sharing their experiences as Asian Americans, particularly in the context of the Midwest. And I think it was a way, this follows on an initiative that we started a number of years ago in the American South. And it's really a way of a commitment to uplifting the experiences of Asian Americans and the stories that are told, that are held within, that are in every region of this country, as we know, but which is not part of the story that the mainstream culture acknowledges. What it's believed is that we are a coastal urban community, and yet the incredible diversity of the Midwest, the incredible diversity here of Detroit and Hamtramck in all ways is remarkable. So actually, one of the first things I wanted to do with you folks centered in Detroit, and Jim and Roland in particular, I have to say, I have two new heroes. You guys grew up here. You guys helped found this movement that we draw so much inspiration from, and you've stayed here. I wonder if you would reflect and maybe connect a little bit, 82 to today. And I didn't want to leave you out, Helen. You earned your reputation here, but I know you're part of our community now in the Bay Area, so we get to talk a lot. But Jim and Roland, it's been such a pleasure. You guys came to the convening of our filmmakers, and I wonder if you would reflect. You guys hosted us at the International Institute, which has such a rich history of welcoming immigrants and bringing people together. I just wonder how you feel in this context of the moment we're in and the reason why we're here this week.
Certainly for me, a little bit about my own background. My family has lived in Detroit now for 108 years, Roland's even longer. And for us, it's really kind of a full circle because all of us are heavily invested in Detroit, born and raised. In fact, my children are the fourth generation of the Shimura family to live in Detroit. And yet, despite being so integrally part of the Detroit area, we're still considered outsiders for the most part. You get strange views from people, and people say, "Where are you from?" I said, "Well, I'm from Detroit. Where are you from?" So, at the same time, it was really heartwarming to be at the conference, meet the filmmakers, and it really is just gives me a lot of hope for the future, because I know that without the stories and without the ability to send the message out there in a good way. And I said before, as a lawyer, there's only so much you can do. You go to court, you can yell, jump up and down. Judge says up and down, maybe sideways in some cases. But the impact of the media is so profound that it really warmed my heart knowing that there's another generation of people out there who have the fire in the belly, the direction and the motivation to tell stories. There's so many stories right now that are untold. I'm sure maybe some of you may have seen Bad Acts, also Who Killed Vincent Chin. I'm not sure if Michael, he was here earlier, Michael C., the producer, was here, but he may have what? He's still here? Or maybe not. Anyway, but it's people like Michael that really give me hope for the future, really does, because I know there are a lot of stories that to be told. And I think out of this group that was convened here in Detroit, there will be a lot of movies and media that will be produced that will have a profound impact over time.
Well, for me,
It's on.
For me, it's really an opportunity right now to just have a recollection of all the things that have occurred over time. Like Jim and his family, my family's been here a long, long time, and we've got different living experiences that are really quite similar. Like being with the International Institute, playing as kids, and then staying on task and being with the International Institute, working with the immigrant community, working on immigration law, just staying on task. That is what I've been doing, and hopefully bringing people along to do the same thing. Also with American Citizens for Justice, with the founding, to address an issue of lack of representation in the civil rights movement among Asian Americans, but staying on task, staying in the town, and working on developing the coalition that occurred then, and it continues to this day. Working with some of the same organizations that were there 40 years ago, still working with the NAACP and ADL, other organizations. The work is not finished, and that's the whole story, just staying on task and teaching the story. I teach at the University of Michigan, Asian American history, Asian American in the civil rights movement. It's just part of that storytelling to maybe get people who don't know the story to just sort of live it through the class, through the readings, and just telling the story. That's part of the process.
Thank you, Roland. Thank you, Jim. So that underscores, I think, one of the points that we've made several times, and I think it centers it, the importance of us being able to share and tell our stories. That's what makes democracy work. That's what's part of this. It's funny, it's interesting. We've heard a lot about the American dream. And the American dream, growing up, I'd always understood, is primarily in material terms of home ownership or cars and food security. And those are very important. But I do think the American dream that inspired my ancestors to come here in the 1850s, I should say on my mother's side, I've come more and more to understand and appreciate. They were revolutionaries, actually, and wanted something for China that in the revolution of 1911 didn't quite provide, and that was a sense of freedom and security, and the ability to participate and be recognized by your character, as Dr. King would say. And I think that's part of the real American dream that we aspire to, and that is under such threat. So I wonder if I actually want to, Helen, I don't want to ask you to do any more that you've done, but for this moment, for each of these moments that we're going through, I know you've been driven, particularly by these last couple of years, and thinking about what this could be. And as we are reaching out to a national streaming audience, and we know that our community is awakened in a way. We know this is such a precious moment. I mean, how are you feeling right now? Are we there yet?
Hello? Yeah, okay. How am I feeling right now? I just feel incredibly grateful for all of you who are here. I feel so grateful to be on this stage right here with Roland, Jim, you, Stephen, the partners at CAM, all of the folks who made this possible. Because Roland, Jim, and I have been kind of bonded for 40 years. We came through a war zone together, and we've gone through a lot. We started talking about this 40th anniversary a couple of years ago, just saying, and then a couple of years ago, of course, the pandemic hit, the dual pandemics of the COVID, but then also the pandemic of anti-Asian hate. And for all of us, it was like, here we go again. We've seen this before. And I do have to say we've been through so much together that we are, I'm sure there are times that they're like, oh my God, Helen, shut up already. or I'm going, you guys are driving me crazy, I want to wring your neck. And throughout all of that, we still knew what the clear goal was of what we did together 40 years ago that still has meaning today, and about keeping, keeping our eyes on the struggle that we have been waging for 40 years, and knowing that today we need the few baby steps, I guess I could say, that we took back then to move them forward even further along. And so right now I feel a lot of gratitude for this moment, for all of you, and also recognizing that we have to move this moment even further along into the movement that we began 40 years ago. So that's kind of where I am.
Thank you, Helen. That's a great segue now to ask the folks in this room, because we have so many leaders and people who are dedicated to helping move this forward. And I sort of see right down here first, we have Christine Chen from APIA Vote.
Hi everyone. Great seeing everyone. So I'm reflecting back because I'm actually originally from Ohio, so I call myself a Midwesterner, even though I've been in DC for over 29 years. And so first of all, I want to thank all of you because, I think I started college about, 6 or 8 years after Vincent Chin. And that really, to me, during that time period, as some of you guys knew, just because as student organizers, we were also starting to create the Midwest Asian American Students Union. We were fighting for Asian American studies. We were reacting to the hostility on college campuses toward Asian Americans. And so I think all that organizing was really a reaction to all the organizing that was done by you and at the national level in reaction to the killing of Vincent Chin. And so looking at that in terms of how those seeds were planted back then, I also look at, 2001 was also another time period where I felt like the seeds were planted really, especially for the South Asian and Muslim communities. And then now 10 years after that, we're now at this moment, right? So as we approach this particular moment, I just came out from LA from a gun control discussion in terms of how the APAC community needs to mobilize around that issue. And then we started talking about a lot of intersectional issues. So in this moment, how can we utilize the 40th anniversary of Vincent Chin and really figure out how we could actually use this as a discussion point and to organize in other areas and other movements that we're in the middle of, especially as we approach the 2022 midterm elections.
That was great. No, that was lovely, Christine. Thank you. And I appreciate the way that you're connecting this to one of those kinds of tools, the essential tool in a democracy of the vote. And we all fear for the state of American democracy now, and one of the only ways we can carrying the hope is I was so impressed with your state senator, is on every level of our leadership, make sure it's represented by good people. But what jumped into my mind, I'm sorry, I'll quickly get to it. I think it's remarkable that this anniversary of the Vincent Chin's murder is now falling on a new national holiday of Juneteenth. And I think that gives us maybe an ongoing time to try to build together this bigger story about American history. And as Renee Tajima Pena told us last night, that's under threat, right? In branding it with critical race theory, there are forces that mean to add to America's amnesia, as Gore Vidal via Michael Dyson reminds us. So I think we have something to do there, and I think it needs to be in every kind of community. And I think you folks here in Detroit, this is maybe a special opportunity to really tie those together.
Well, one thing, and you may be very aware of this, but the movement that was started back in 1983 wasn't possible but for the fact we reached out to other communities of color, other religious groups, and particularly you heard about the late Horace Sheffield Jr., who was kind of a godfather of ACJ, gave us the ability to access and contact all kinds of politicians and other civic leaders in the Detroit area. But the moral of the story, as then and today, is that we have to build coalitions. We have to understand there's a common core of issues we're all facing, no matter what community we come from, our religious background. In some ways, this whole idea of having this event was the fact, listen, I'm not young. I'll always be younger than Mo and Helen. That's okay. But the fact is, we've been doing this for 40 years. We all know that the clock's ticking in our lives. And at some point, there has to be a new generation of people to step up, not only fill the void, but take us in places we weren't able to take the community at large. And I think, if nothing else, this event has been a starting point, sort of a new catalyst for the future. And regarding the campaign, I think the issue of CRT is critically important. I know that several educator friends of mine are saying they're being attacked, and these programs may be eliminated very shortly. Something has to be on page 1 during the upcoming campaign. But also, speaking about guns, as you know, these white militia type folks are running around with AR-15s ready to kill us at any point in time. And this dialogue is not just forget the Second Amendment for a moment. This is a public health threat across society. And that debate has to be placed on page 1. Unfortunately, because of the war in Ukraine and the pandemic, anti-Asian hate has kind of fallen back to page 10 in the papers. I think it's about time we have to step up and try to reset the counter in terms of the narrative, because right now we're being lost in the shuffle of the current chaos that's in society. I know, I can say more about that as well.
Well, I think right now it's an opportunity to acknowledge the coalition building that occurred 40 years ago. We do not forget the coalition that was formed with Detroit Association of Black Organizations, NAACP Detroit, ADL, and New Detroit, and other organizations. Those bonds continue to this day, and the bonds are growing. And the need is ever increased. During COVID, there is so much worsening of the race relations climate that really that coalition building has to be renewed and enhanced now. And it's time to acknowledge the partnerships that we have, working with organizations like Access, Black Family Development, Hispanic Development Corporation. That's what we're doing locally, and that needs to be replicated across the country. In all places where we reside, we need to be working in coalition with those organizations. At the national level, OCA working with the national, NCAPA, as an example. Just coalition building just needs to continue to be strengthened to address those issues like gun violence that affects our community. And K-12 education, enhancing the API presence. That's something that has to happen state by state, at the national level, local level, grassroots level. So that's my statement.
Thank you very much, Roland. And that we've started to add to this list kind of these points of leverage in education, next generation. Thank you. Helen, do you have anything on this thing?
I guess I would like to say that in coalition building and all the work we're doing and looking toward the next presidential election, all of the midterms, and then that You know, you build coalitions by connecting the dots. We built a movement here, started that by connecting the dots. What was the commonality that Minjin Lee talked about? You know, making other people understand our Asian American humanity, but also us putting ourselves in other people's shoes to see their common humanity, and then to connect those dots in whatever ways we can. I mean, we've talked about storytelling and things like that, but that's what it's about. And I think that what's kept us apart so much is, you know, when we have these different movements, we're in a society, and the American culture is so much about putting things in boxes into, one-dimensional identities that can then be tabulated in data. Our American culture is very data and simplifying, finding the most simple ways of describing people. And we all know none of us fit into one box, so how do we then break out of that? Funding, government, education, it's all, you go through and you have to fill in one dot, right? And so that is a way to kind of gear us all into thinking of ourselves in one track. And so, when we think about Buffalo, Uvalde, El Paso, Atlanta, Indianapolis, or Black Lives Matter, or Me Too. I mean, we're sitting here in a week where the last couple weeks were terrible. We're looking at a week ahead of when the shoe is going to drop, or several shoes going to drop from the Supreme Court, whether it's attacking women or attacking immigrants, or all of the different things that we know. All of those are ways to keep us from connecting the dots. And so one of the things I think about is, how can we take things like what happened 40 years ago to Vincent Chin and the solidarity that we built, and to be able to tell that story in the Asian American communities, which many of our communities don't even know about this story, and bring it there, but also to take it out to other communities, to be present. The incredible film Bad Acts was about a Cambodian Latinx family that stood up to white supremacists because they were standing with Black Lives Matter. And so how do we take that story elsewhere into communities beyond the Asian community? When there are issues of immigration, we know that immigration is talked about, immigration reform, and there are no Asian faces that are even brought to talk about that, when our Asian American communities are the most impacted by anti-immigrant laws, policies, etc. So I think it really is incumbent on all of us to find ways to connect the dots, to be in other spaces, to show our face in places. When I try to put myself in the shoes of, if I were an activist in the Black community, I kind of think anti-Asian violence or developing a relationship with Asian American communities would not be the highest priority on my list. Not because I don't care, but because there are so many other issues being faced, in the Black community. So I think for our communities, it takes making that crossing to the other side of the room and making that effort. We did do that back in, the 1980s. We had incredible support from Black community leaders who introduced us to other communities, but we had to actually show up and do that. So I think within our community, there's a lot we have to do, and we know that, Asian Americans at this point are so diverse in opinion and fractured in so many ways. But so one of the things that we've done is we put together this guide that is in every one of your, what do we call them? Gift bags, goodie bags, whatever. And, we have in here the story of the civil rights movement led by African American people and the connectedness to Asian Americans. But the main story is about the Black civil rights movement. We're translating that into Chinese first and several other Asian languages. It's going to be online because we want our newer immigrant brothers and sisters to be able to read this too, because they don't get that story. So we have to find ways to connect the dots, and I guess that's what I think we have to do in the coming elections, because keeping us apart is what's going to defeat us, and we can't let that happen. So let's connect the dots. And Christine, I remember when you were in college. So.
Thank you. Right here is.
Okay, I'm Daphne Clark, and so thank you so much for the tremendous work that you have been doing, keeping the issues alive, and the panel that was right before this as well too. So I want to pick up on several themes. One was unity that came up in the panel. And I think, as we all know, for the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community, it's extremely diverse. But I've always said that, unfortunately, all these hate crimes is the one issue that unifies us, because nobody can tell us apart. So unfortunately, it is the one binding issue. So how can we use, unfortunately, the attention that's been placed on us right now to really unify the AA and HPI community? The second thing, too, is taking off on what Helen just said. I have often thought that what we really need is to take Asian Americans down to the Deep South to go through the civil rights history down there. So, and granted, most of Asian Americans came after '65, so it's really after the civil rights. So we don't really know about the civil rights movement. How can we really instill and make people understand what African Americans have done that really paved the way for us right now? And the third thing is really the coalition building is so critical. We did it 40 years ago. We still need to do so much more coalition building with the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community, and the African American, and the Hispanic, Native American, LGBTQ. The coalition work is so key and critical, and those, I think, are really going to be the nuggets to really continue to move the movement forward. But thank you for your leadership as well, too.
Thank you very much, Daphne. I'll just I see some more hands, which is wonderful. I'll just quickly say, it is a point of hope. We know that the Asian American community in Georgia stood up and really helped turn that election, to a better state, and that was a wonderful example of coalition, and I hope we can keep that up. Is anyone here who wants to respond? But if not, I'll recognize another question or comment right here.
Hello. Hi, I'm Emily Ho, and I've known all three of the people, well, I'm sorry, not you, but all three of the founders of ACJ since I was about 11, when Vincent Chin was killed, and my mom was really involved with all of you. I heard you did this yesterday, Helen, when I saw you, and I'm sorry. And I'm here on behalf of my mom, because she was well enough to come. Okay, how do you hold on? But being in community with you guys was so important to me formatively, although I didn't know it. I now teach, I'm a law professor, I teach at the University of Cincinnati College of Law. I teach critical race theory, so I'm right in there. I've been teaching it for over 20 years and writing as a critical race scholar, and you are part of the sort of group that I need to thank in part because of that, along with my parents. But one thing I think is really important, I've been working a lot on fighting these educational gag orders, which are these anti-CRT initiatives in state legislatures all across the country, including in Ohio, where it's pending in the state. These bills are pending in the state house. But one thing that I've really learned is, so I'm working a lot with the African American Policy Forum, which is Kim Franchise, sort of nonprofit, and who's the leading CRT scholar and feminist. But one thing that I've really learned about how to move things forward is that we just have to stop being on the defensive all the time. Oppression occurs in cycles repeatedly through the same methodologies. Chinese exclusion is the model. Chinese exclusion laws are the model for exclusion laws. And I think we need to demand a more inclusive curriculum in K-12, as well as in higher education. So not just sort of fight back against these anti-CRT divisive concept bills, but say, our children deserve a more inclusive curriculum, and a curriculum that centers also resistance and liberation. Because the history that we learn over and over again is history of oppression. And I think we just don't realize it because those of us who have resisted are rendered invisible in the curriculum, right? Anyway, yeah, my head is spinning. This has been really wonderful so far. There's a lot of other things that I wish I could say. I'm completely overwhelmed. But I do want to thank you and Sam for my time.
Thank you very much.
I want to mention one thing. Her mom, Judy, was an absolutely critical part of the movement back in the 80s. She was one of the group of people that did newsletters. Mind you, back then, this is pretty primitive. No internet, no cell phones, no Twitter or
No fax
messaging.
machines either.
No faxes either. They used to send smoke signals to get a hold of telephone. No, seriously, without her mom, we wouldn't be here today. Honest to God, she was one of the people tirelessly working. I hope your mom will be watching and you enjoy it. Thank you again. But I think one of the problems right now is I think we need to be more civically engaged. I think we have a record number. I think Senator Chang's here. We need more people involved in policy. I'm not saying you have to run for public office, but get involved. Parent committees, especially in public school districts. You got to raise hell, pardon my French here, to make things work. Because without that engagement, I know Asian parents say, "Oh my God, I got to get my kid into Harvard." Well, that's fine and well, but the fact is that the curriculum is critically important. It's not just about us. It's about trying to educate the masses. And without that component of critical race theory, we're going to get the same whitewashing over and over and over again. All I can say growing up, I was taking American history, you might get one paragraph about Chinese exclusion, maybe half a paragraph about the incarceration of Japanese, like my mom was, and that has to change. But it starts with parents and people being civically involved. You have to go out there, as John Lewis used to say, make good trouble, basically. So we have to do it.
It's very clearly a time for public input and activism because the legislators, in many cases, are doing their job. They're getting the bills, set in different states, but they're not necessarily getting to the public hearing stage, getting the public to weigh in that it's important to have that input in K-12 curriculum, API content. And so really it's a call to action for us to call for hearings and get progress on these bills and not just wait for the legislatures to take action, on these bills. And it's really important that we as citizens and parents work on bulking up on the K-12 curriculum, fundraising for the libraries in terms of API content, funding, books for the libraries, classrooms, that sort of thing, and working on professional development, getting the content to the teachers through the professional development, because a lot of the education is done, at the classroom level. Planning is at the classroom level, not at even the school district level or the state level. It really takes a collective effort to really affect change in terms of the curriculum.
Thank you, Robin. I think we'll try to fit them in quickly if we can. We've got one there and then maybe room for one more here. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm David Hahn. First of all, I'm really moved by this event and all of us here gathered together having this conversation. It's been close to 50 years since I landed in Detroit as a teenager. And so a lot of things have changed and progressed quite a bit since those days. So encouraged by that. At the same time, my heart is very heavy as we engage in this dialogue. When I think about the African American history, civil rights, and all the progress with the African American identity and position in the United States, with the shorter history with Asians in America, that as much as a lot have changed, laws have been instituted, and policies and programs and all kinds of things, including education, recognition, have taken place over the lengthy period. It's still a short history. And things seem to repeat in cycles. Every X number of decades, and for African Americans, even hundreds of years later, things repeat in cycle, and the circularity of these issues that we're experiencing is weighing heavy on me as I think about our children and now our grandchildren. That so I see this as a problem of the human heart, and Helen, you spoke to it. Min Jin has spoke to it about humanizing and being relatable. In addition to all the things that we're visibly seeing here, what can we as individuals do differently to contribute to humanizing so that we are relatable and others are relatable to us? Until we can get to the human heart, I think policies, laws, all of these things help, but they have a limit.
Thank you very much. Helen.
Well, thank you for that, David. I would like to just say, as somebody who writes stories, and really my involvement with back in 1982 was as one of the people who initially wrote the press releases, wrote some of the stories and speeches and press conferences. And the thing about what I see in our Asian American communities is a lot of times there's we stood up back then, but then sort of a reluctance to let a lot of different voices out there. There's sort of a tendency to say, well, if we're all going to be out there, let's have one voice. And the thing about it is, one voice is great at different times, but we have to support so many, all the different story threads that there are, because every one of us has a different story to tell. And so it is true that, how do we make ourselves relatable? But relatable to whom? And sometimes, if I'm going to be out there as a queer, Asian, lesbian, Chinese American, ABC woman, that is a story that is not going to be so relatable to some people. Maybe some of the, let's say, more conservative, newer immigrants who just really don't want to recognize that, for example, there are queer people in the Asian community. So I would just say relatable is relative, and relatable to whom. But so I think what I would love to see in our communities is supporting the many, many different kind of stories within our communities. I sometimes see activists who, for example, want to take over the Golden Gate Bridge, throw things over it. And I myself, at this point in my life, might not have been one of the people to do this, but I support their right to do it. I support their voices there, and even if I disagree with them. And so I think that's one of the things in our community, to really uphold the multiplicity of voices that we have, to let those stories shine, to support those stories, in the whole CAMP program. And when David Siv and the Bad Acts folks, they were up here and they said, as well as the Who Killed Vincent Chin producers and directors, saying, let PBS and POV know that you would like to see more of this content on your local stations. Even if you might not have agreed with the story, let our stories grow. And so that's one of the things. So while I agree, we have to make ourselves seen as more human. That's the bottom line. But our humanity is complex. We are human beings after all. So there are many, many different ways to describe us and tell our stories. So I just hope we all make room for each other. That's how we have more of our voices coming out, and then we're not so much seen as the single one-dimensional monolith out there. So let those stories grow, those plants.
I can suggest that people should sort of have a Rolodex of the people in journalism. Everybody probably knows somebody in the AAJA, Asian American Journal Association. Contact them. I'm sure they're looking for personal stories to be able to tell. So, contact your friends in the AAJA, and they will probably tell our stories through them.
Thank you. Also, I want to recognize, we have many people that we're going to have to stay here longer, so I'm sorry, but actually, I'm going to first segue. We're going to have Rededication in a moment. But first, Paula Madison, because you represent a lot of us. You've spent your life professionally in journalism, and yeah, thank you. And then Renee, you'll be next, and maybe they're going to kick us out then. But
thank you. So I'm going to take this in a different direction, and I am very grateful to have participated all of these days and hear the history and the remembrance. I kind of wonder if these conversations were being led by people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, and were they people who were Asian American, that perhaps there might be mixed race people included in the conversation. Because the conversation so far has gone more in the direction of these communities being siloed. There are Asian Americans, there are African Americans, there are fill in the blank. So I happen to be Chinese American, I happen to be Jamaican, I'm African American. There's a lot mixed up in me, and my concern here is, as we're talking about coalition building, is that the fastest growing demographic in the United States is mixed race. And it's not being reflected here in any of the conversation. What we're talking about is, how do we work together? And there is a significant population of Chinese Americans beginning in the 1850s who were mixed race. Because those so-called bachelors came to these United States and had sex. And there were not, for the most part, many Chinese American women here. So we have a long, storied history of being mixed race. And as we're talking about bridging, and how do we tell these stories, and how do they not end up as monolithic, what I would offer is that if you go into social media and you look at the stories being told by mixed race AAPI people, it's usually a very painful story. Not being accepted by either race in the family.
Actually, Paula, thank you for raising that question, and it's an important one. I was actually going to bring up, it's not just our grandparents who had sex with outside their ethnic groups. I'm the parent of Latinx kids and Chinese, and a transgender daughter, I will tell you, and they are all accepted and loved. And I do think that's part of, to me, it underscores what Helen said too. I mean, all of our paths are unique. They all have tremendous validity, and we need to be careful, those of us, particularly in the storytelling space,
but voice
not to
has to be given
essentialize.
to it. It's not being mentioned here at all.
Oh, and
and voice
Bad Axe is a Cambodian and Mexican.
Bad Axe was amazing, and what I'm saying is that as the conversations are ensuing about relationships and coalition building, what's not being talked about is that there are people inside of the Asian American community who you would not know are Asian American because they may not look stereotypically. That's all I'm getting at.
Yeah,
and so for a lot of us, we end up feeling excluded.
Yeah.
Right. So as these conversations are occurring, please look within your own families and within your own communities and find the people who have in fact bridged these communities and probably might be able to help in this way.
Thank you. Thank you, Paula. Thank you. And it is so important that we not essentialize our own experience. Absolutely. And there's a way in stories that it happens so often, right? That people pick up one visual cue and they create a wrongful picture. But Renee, it's so wonderful to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you, Paula. I'm the mother of a Mexicanese boy. But I am also going to take this in a different direction. This is my third day here. I mean, my mind is blown. And I was remembering interviewing Ron Evans, and it struck me that it was so normal. Because I think at the time we thought that racial violence was, like the redneck guy in To Kill a Mockingbird, or rode up on a horse with a hood. But here he was riding up in a Chrysler, with a Louisville Slugger, like in his truck. And then thinking in the past couple of years, now it's riding up in a Prius, or, the guys in the Hawaiian shirts with the tiki torches at Charlottesville, and the people, I mean, there's an extraordinary scene in Bad Axe where a family has a restaurant, and these neighbors actually with polo shirts, whatever, they come in and are just in their anti-maskers, in the face of the family, and the casual, entitled violence. And I know a lot of us have confronted that violence in the past few years, or even longer than that. So that violence has become so normalized. It's normalized. Maybe in 1982, we thought, Ron Evans, this is so, I won't say that because the 1980s was like a whole season of anti-Asian violence. But today, it's, normalized all the way up to the, highest, to the White House, not this White House, but the previous White House, and maybe the White House in 2024. So how do we address that? I mean, that's why this, it's so brilliant to say remembrance and rededication, because there is a fight ahead. It says, if all of you were planning, let's map out the fight ahead.
Thank you, Renee. Much regret that I know we're over time. So if we're going to move it outside, those of us who can, we're going to carry on this conversation. But I want to remind you all, come back tonight at 7 p.m. We have a cultural, artistic, musical program, because as we have just noted, we can't live by rhetoric alone. We must have art and culture in our lives too. And then tomorrow there is a remembrance and ceremony, and we're going to carry on these conversations of coalition building. Thank you so much for joining us. Please, one more hand for the members of the American Citizens for Justice.
Thank you all, and can I just say one piece of housekeeping? So tomorrow we are going to meet here again at 11 a.m. for 2 panels, but in the afternoon, tomorrow is June 19th, it is Juneteenth, but it is also 40 years to the date that the years pile up. But anyway, 40 years to the date that Vincent Chin was attacked. And so we are going to have a interfaith ceremony. We had incredible multi-faith leadership back in the 1980s. We're going to have that at a place that is yet undisclosed, but you can figure it out. And we have not made it public because we are in this time that we are in, and we don't want to help people who might want to disrupt us. So we are asking you to meet here. Those of you who are local, you probably know how to get there yourselves, but you must register because we are going to send something you could print out like a dashboard placard, because we are checking who's coming into the space. And those of you who meet here, we actually have some shuttle buses that can go if you don't want to drive yourself. So, but you have to register for these things. So please go to vincentchin.org. We are trying to do these things for security and safety purposes. And we look forward to seeing you at all of these things. So stay on it, and thank you so much.